So the title of this talk, this is a variation of one that I've given a few times now. And the focus of it is on the conflict or the perceived conflict between science and religion, and particularly between science and Christianity, as portrayed primarily in the book of Genesis. And so people have tried to resolve that conflict in a variety of different ways. And so I want to just kind of break that down, why there's a conflict and what I think the proper way to view it is. So to introduce what the conflict is, there's a couple of verses here which highlight it very clearly, I think. The Bible makes certain very factual claims about the world and how it came to be. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Very simple statement. That's the beginning of the entire Bible. It says that there is a creator and that everything else that is came from the creator. It says later on, starting in the first chapter of Genesis and summarized here in Exodus 20, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. So it says he made the world in 6 days, which is very different from the naturalistic view now. And then finally, in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7, it says, and Jehovah God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul, which statement is basically that God created man in more or less the same form that he exists today. He did not develop slowly over time in a natural process from other creatures. So that's contrary to what we learn in most biology classes now. And so there's other statements in Genesis that are also contested. It says that the world was originally perfect. It was corrupted by Adam and Eve's rebellion, as detailed in Genesis 3. It says that sin did not exist, death did not exist until after that point. It says there was a massive global flood that destroyed all the people and animals except for those Noah saved on the ark. And if you add up all the chronologies of the Old Testament, you will conclude that all of these events happened less than 10,000 years ago, because there's a detailed chronology in Genesis 5 and later on in Genesis 11 that gives ages of each father as the son was born, going from Adam to Abraham. And then, well, we're pretty certain that Abraham lived about 4,000 years ago, roughly. But you can get the exact figure if you take other verses throughout the Old Testament up to the time of the fall of Jerusalem, which secular history will place around 570 BC. So there's not really any contesting how long ago that was. Anyway, there's not room for varying that date a whole lot from the Bible unless you just dismiss part of it. So one of the approaches, which is fairly common now, is to say, well, the book of Genesis is mythical. It's made to tell us a story. It's not made to relay actual history. It's made to be a parable about the way the world is more than it is a statement of what exactly happened. However, let's consider how was Genesis viewed by New Testament authors. So in the book of Matthew, Genesis is referred to by Jesus. He compares it to the coming, his return, the rapture, basically. He says, the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. Until the day that Noah entered the ark, they did not understand. Until the flood came and took them all away, so will the coming of man be. And so he's saying, just like that was, it just came all of a sudden. Nobody was expecting it except for Noah and those that listened to him, which were basically only his wife, his 3 sons and their wives. So suddenly will the rapture come. Paul wrote about Adam and compared him to Christ. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all have sinned. And so he's talking, of course, about Adam and the original sin, where he ate the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's comparing that to Christ, who came to take all sin away, if you read the rest of that chapter. And then Peter, in his book, he mentions the construction of the ark and the salvation of the 8 persons on it. And he's talking about that as familiar history, basically. He compares the passage of the ark to the baptism, actually. It says it's just they were basically baptized by the flood. So did these people portray Genesis like it could be mythical? Not really. They portrayed it very much as if this was a historical event. It's especially clear with Jesus's usage of it, because he's definitely comparing it to something that is really going to happen that we should be aware of and be ready for. So that really weakens his point if you say that his whole comparison is something that never really happened. So as I can see it, there's basically four possibilities. Either the New Testament writers knew that Genesis was an allegory and they were confusing on purpose, or they thought it was history and were mistaken and were confusing by accident, or it really is history and so they were accurate, or finally the possibility that the writings that we have don't accurately preserve what was actually said. Now, the first two of these are not very satisfactory reasons for self-evident ways. The fourth one is contradicted by the variety of early manuscripts we have that indicate that the Gospels and the other New Testament writings are very accurately preserved. So it's pretty certain that they did actually say what we have today that is indicated that they said. So I think the only really satisfactory viewpoint, looking at the scripture alone as a whole, is that you have to take Genesis as history. And otherwise, your whole view of Christianity is somewhat unsatisfactory in itself. So what consequences would that have? Well, first of all, let's look at what Paul says about Genesis, basically. Going back to what he said in Romans chapter 5, he said, as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all have sinned. And then later in verse 17, for if by the transgression of one death reigned through the one, much more those who receive the abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness will reign in life through the one, Jesus Christ. So basically you have this kind of three-step process here. First you have Adam, the first man. He rebelled, which brought sin into the world. And because of sin, the wages of sin is death. So death exists in the world because sin exists. All those who sin later die as a consequence of that. In contrast to that whole three-step process, you have Christ, who was the opposite of Adam and also like him. Where Adam rebelled, Christ obeyed. As a result, he was not sinful but was righteous. And because he was righteous, he had the ability to bring us the gift of life by paying for our sins. So only a perfect sacrifice to God was able to bear the penalty for sin. This was the pattern established all the way back in the beginning of the Old Testament. Sacrifices had to be without blemish. So Christ, by being righteous, was able to bring us the gift of life. And so you see the similarity and the contrast there. Now, my point is this. According to Paul, death comes from sin. Before sin, there was no death. And sin came from the actions of Adam. Redemption from sin comes from the actions of Jesus. And so there's a symmetry and a contrast there. Now consider what happens if the first three of those points are not true. Because if you take the naturalistic view of the world, then death does not come from sin. Death has always been here. Sin doesn't even really mean anything exactly, so there's always been death. And Adam is basically fictional. If you do consider there to be a proto-ancestor of man, then he has no particular significance in the natural history of the world. So none of that part is true. Why would Paul's whole argument make any sense if you dismiss the first 3 points? If you get rid of those first 3 points, the whole conclusion that we can be made free through Christ kind of falls apart from that, because Paul's whole argument operates on the basis of this symmetry and contrast. And so finally, we kind of come to this, things come to a head here. What we learn from a naturalistic view of the world and what we learn from the Bible are contradictory as presented so far. And so you have to, okay, you have two different means of finding the truth, and they contradict one another, then one needs to be superior to the other. Otherwise, you can't resolve anything, right? So you have to decide then, if religion and science don't agree, which one do you believe over the other one? Well, the answer to that is a little bit complicated, so I'm not going to answer it outright yet. But instead, I'm going to present my way of looking at the world, basically. And the first one of those is that truth is more important than scientific method. So I'm not saying necessarily that science is unreliable. I'm saying that it's only reliable insofar as it is a way of finding truth. So if there's a point where science is unreliable, I'd rather be reliable than be scientific. I also assume that God inspired the writing of the Bible to be clear and reliable. Now, I'm putting this as an assumption, but there are reasons I could give to justify this. They kind of are reasons that I produce after believing it. So it's not exactly reasons why I believe it. It's things that I firm up my belief in it with. Also, based on the first two of those, the fact that I believe the Bible, I believe that God created my mind and my senses to understand the world, and he made that world to be understood. Because of those two things are true, science is reliable means of finding truth. And so I've basically produced an argument for believing science, but it's based on believing the Bible first, which kind of puts the two in a hierarchy and establishes that the Bible's first, religion is below it in reliability. And finally, God wants to be found. And that's true both in the Bible and in the natural creation. So there should be evidence that the naturalistic, the materialistic view of things is wrong, if this assumption is true. Now, notice the way I'm presenting that is a scientific method sort of argument. I make an assumption, then I go look for evidence for it to verify or disprove it. So I'm actually using the scientific method in this. And these pictures here are some of the scientific publications that I've made over time from materials science, which is my area of expertise. So now let's look more deeply at the contradiction that I've been alluding to. According to standard evolutionary theory, all life arose from single-celled organisms which spontaneously formed. Over billions of years, these evolved into the complex forms of life we see today. I believe the current estimate is that life began somewhere between 3 and 4.5 billion years ago. And most of the forms of life we see today are in the fossil record, which goes back to roughly 500 million years ago. The natural selection process is given as the main driver for introducing more complex life. Life originated without any creator and built up complexity over time without any outside influence. Basically, death is a very important part of this process. Without death, you don't have natural selection. You have to have competing things. You have to have a dog-eat-dog world, basically, for this to work. So it's not compatible at all with the idea of God creating a perfect world and man introducing sin into it. Those are completely contrasting philosophical ideas. You can't try to reconcile them. You have to accept one or the other. So I've already told you I accept the Bible rather than that evolutionary theory. So here's some things that help me be more confident in that conclusion. I told you what my assumptions were. Here's some of the assumptions that you need in order for evolution to be considered reliable. The first one is also one of mine. Our senses, ability to reason, and experiences and memories are reliable. I'm not going to read all of these because I have more slides on each one. Okay. So that one made sense when I gave it as one of my assumptions because I based it on being a created being and God wanting me to be able to understand him and his world. But why, if you believe in evolution, would you assume that you are a reliable investigator? If you are a product of random chance, why would your brain be reliable to think about itself or about the world around it in a logical way? Do we trust computers? Those were made by an intelligent creator. So why would a random process do better? Even Charles Darwin has a quote which alludes to the exact same idea. He says, "But then within me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy." So, I mean, this is a sort of weakness that goes all the way back to Darwin. It's like it's on a very basic philosophical level. If you assume a strictly naturalistic process, why would you then assume that you're able to conclude that reliably? Second assumption, evolution assumes that there is nothing except for the physical world. This is sometimes called empiricism, which means basically if you cannot encounter it with your senses, it doesn't exist. As a counterpoint to that, I present math. Can you interact directly with integers? What do y'all think? I mean, you can count pieces of pizza, right? But you could also slice them differently or cut one of them in half. We know very intuitively what integers are, but there's no perfect examples of them anywhere in the physical world. And yet we all agree what they are. We all know what 4 is. We all know what 2 plus 2 is. And yet there's no perfect example of it anywhere. We all know what a perfect sphere is, but you can't find one. It's rather a problem for empiricism, as has been noted by some fairly significant people. So Roger Penrose, who's a Nobel Prize winner in physics, wrote that there appears to be some profound reality about these mathematical concepts, going quite beyond the mental deliberations of any particular mathematician. It is as though human thought is, instead of being guided towards some external truth, a truth which has a reality of its own. And so he is not an empiricist. He believes that there are things which exist outside of the natural world, even though I don't believe he believes in any God. You can have other beliefs, other than God. You can believe in integers without believing in God. I mean, that is a reasonable point of view for that as far as it goes. Here's an article from the Smithsonian Magazine, which was really interesting, called "What is Math?" It says scientists tend to be empiricists. They imagine the universe to be made up of things that we can touch and taste and so on, things we can learn about through observation and experiments. The idea of something existing outside of space and time makes empiricists nervous. It sounds embarrassingly like the way religious believers talk about God. And God was banished from respectable scientific discourse a long time ago. Sound significant, right? Later on, he says, if the proof of the Pythagorean theorem exists outside of space and time, why not the golden rule or even the divinity of Jesus Christ? And so even people that think deeply about this, the philosophy of math, without being religious people, recognize that there's something strange about the existence of these proofs and perfect geometry, perfect math and integers in a world that's empirical. It does not make sense to have perfection that we all recognize, we can understand, we can analyze, and yet you can't observe. It certainly doesn't seem to jive well with the scientific method. Assumption 3, uniformitarianism is reliable. Do y'all know what uniformitarianism is? Okay. The uniformitarianism is the assumption that natural laws and processes operating at present day have always operated in the past and apply everywhere. It's the idea that if Maxwell's laws of electromagnetism work here, then they also work in the core of the sun and on Jupiter and in Andromeda Galaxy. And they worked 500 million years ago in the same way they do now. Without uniformitarianism, you cannot analyze the past reliably because you have to assume that when you start winding the clock backwards, that the same physical laws that we have now worked the same way then, so you can actually keep on winding the clock the same way. Sometimes this is a problem, which was actually mentioned by Peter in his second letter. He says, know this, first of all, that in the last days mockers will come, saying, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. And then he produces the counter argument. For when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God, the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of the water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded by water. But by his word, the present heavens and earth are being reserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment and the destruction of ungodly men. Now, you might say, well, you can't use the Bible to discredit evolution in that way. We're trying to find things that evolution is internally inconsistent about. And that's true. Look at the middle picture down there. You've all seen the argument the dinosaurs were destroyed by an asteroid. That's certainly an outside element that completely disrupted all the natural stuff that was going on at the time. And it's something that we cannot really analyze well now, some 65 million years later, right? I mean, it's just kind of something that's thrown in to try to make sense of what happened. Unfortunately, the theory of evolution has a great many of these now in various branches of it. They can't satisfactorily explain the formation of the moon. From the Big Bang to the present day, they had to introduce several periods of rapid expansion of the universe with no particular known cause. Even the process of biological evolution itself, they've started introducing periods of rapid mutational development with no particular explanation for why it happened other than that it matches their data better. The uniformitarianism is not held to rigorously by anybody now, and yet it's necessary if you're going to reliably investigate the past. You need to have an explanation at least for why the natural order got upset. Okay, assumption 4, life originated without a creator. This one is a key part of evolution a lot of times. And of course, you have people who say, well, evolution happened after life was created. I mean, that makes sense, but why would you say that? I don't understand why you would induce a creator and then regulate him to only creating life and then doing nothing with it. So I have a textbook, a biology textbook, which makes several quotes here, which are rather interesting. In particular, it very explicitly says that there are 3 different possibilities, at least for the origin of life: special creation, evolution, and extraterrestrial origin. And then it says explicitly, we will only consider the last one, because they claim only the last one permits testable hypotheses to be constructed, and so provides the only scientific explanation that could be potentially disproven by experiment by obtaining and analyzing actual information. So, issue, of course, is that they don't actually treat this in a scientific way because they've never been able to reproduce the origin of life in a lab in any conditions at all, and it does not look likely that they ever will. So I'm not certain what they even mean by testable hypotheses, because there aren't any for the evolution, the creation of life from non-life. 5. Real science must explain everything without alluding to a creator. This was referred to in the book I just read from. It said only a scientific explanation will be permitted in this book, and you can't have a scientific explanation with a creator. Notice that's a definition of what science can do that is apart from the scientific method. It's an assumption. It's not actually part of science. And it's wrong. So what kind of evidence would be permissible as an explanation that said there must have been an intelligent force of some sort that created this? Y'all have probably heard the analogy of the watch in the desert, right? Where somebody finds a watch and says, well, obviously this was made by somebody and dropped here. It didn't naturally arise. Makes sense, sure. Where you draw the line with that can get blurry. Is there evidence in the world today that can only be satisfactorily explained by a creator? What do y'all think? Well, y'all are here, so I assume you think there is. But it's hard to present it in a concise way. What is satisfactory evidence that can only be explained by a creator? I would submit that DNA and RNA and the way they interact together is an excellent, simple example. Because what this is the most complex coding language in use anywhere in the universe. So if you have something that is a language, it communicates information, it's understood, it's interpreted, it's transmitted. How does a language come into existence without an intelligence? Does it even make sense to have a language without an intelligence? So I would say that that is actually excellent evidence of an intelligence in design. And you could consider that to be a testable hypothesis too. Go find a case where something created a language without there being any intelligence involved. And you can certainly find examples of every language that did come from an intelligence. So that's data for and against the hypothesis. 6. Complex life forms formed naturally from simple ones. So you may think, well, maybe the origin of life required a creator, but after that, evolution seems to be more satisfactory in explaining how all of the complex life forms arose from simple ones. Actually, that's not true. So y'all have seen probably something like a tree up top here. That's kind of the conventional idea of Darwinian evolution. The actual fossil record looks more like the bottom picture here when you're looking at all the different kinds of animals. As you can see, about 2/3 to 3/4 of them all started occurring about the same layer. So you must have had a massive amount of evolution that happened within a very short period of time. About, I say a short period of time, they'd call it 30 million years, but compared to the rest of the fossil record, that's extremely short. Some people call it the Cambrian explosion, and then other people say, well, it's not fair to call it an explosion. 30 million years is a long time. It's not a long time for having almost all of the existing animal kinds show up at the same time. It's not satisfactory at all for explaining how we have so much variety of animal life. So there's an issue there. Also, there's genetic degradation. There's people that have studied the rate at which harmful genetic mutations accumulate. And of course, they accumulate faster than beneficial ones. We all know about genetic diseases and things, which are fairly common. Beneficial mutations are extremely rare. So if you have a population that just continues on for millions and millions of years, harmful genetic mutations get absorbed into the entire gene pool over time if they're not completely detrimental and cause people to die out. And so DNA-based organisms should go extinct over the scale of millions and millions of years. And in fact, we don't see nearly that much genetic degradation now, and we can see it accumulating now over time. So the rate does not match how much there is if you extrapolate backwards. Another issue is the concept of irreducible complexity. A lot of us here are engineers. We understand how machines work. You have something like an internal combustion engine. It requires at a minimum 4 different parts that have to work in harmony in order to produce from the explosion, that is the input power, to produce a rotating torque outward. You have to have multiple moving parts to do that, and they have to all be synced to work correctly together. It's fairly complex. Biological mechanisms are actually a lot more complex. The bombardier beetle there has a defensive mechanism which combines 2 chemicals which produce an explosive gas. The other picture is a bacterial flagellum, which is basically a propeller, which it spins extremely quickly to swim through water at an incredible rate of speed. Both of these mechanisms require all of the parts involved to work in harmony in order to produce an effect which gives them a survival advantage. These things cannot accumulate slowly over time, gathering complexity. Dye is another common example. You can't just say, well, natural selection gradually built this up from something much simpler. The whole mechanism requires all of the parts to work at once. The whole thing had to come together at the same time, or else natural selection doesn't work. So it's rather a problem for saying natural selection can explain the complexity that we see today. There's also the fact that the fossil record is full of gaps. We don't see nearly enough transitional forms. Apes to men is a very common example, and of course people claim that there's all sorts of transitional forms. If you look at them very closely, you'll notice that most of them are either almost exactly like modern man or almost exactly like one of the modern ape species. So the ones that are actually in the middle are very far and few between, and they can be explained by bone deformities, arthritis, and other things of that nature, just as well as by being a transitional form. It's not satisfactory at all for evidence. And finally, this is the last assumption, which is common in evolution and is kind of a problem. The universe formed on its own at the Big Bang, or it is infinitely old and has always existed. So, as y'all are probably aware, the whole universe is expanding and is tending towards equilibrium, right? So if you wind the clock backwards, you have to come to a beginning point, a point where you can't go any further backwards because everything compresses down to a point. And it's a very odd point because it's also, you're going backwards from equilibrium at the same time. And so that makes it really weird. The issue is, what happened before that? What caused that to be as it is? Well, you need an outside force of some sort. And pretty much all cosmologists agree that what we can understand from science alone cannot explain it. Cosmologists were very hesitant at first to even admit that their models said the universe has a beginning. They wanted it to be infinitely old because that is much easier to explain from an empirical point of view. But it can't. The scientific laws we have definitely say the universe had a beginning. So Landau and Lifshitz here were very famous physicists. They're dead now. But they tried in their textbook here on statistical physics to explain away the beginning of the universe by saying that gravity was exempt from the law of increasing entropy. Basically, they said that gravity doesn't obey the second law of thermodynamics, which is more or less complete nonsense that you would not expect 2 credible physicists to say. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. In fact, there's a lot of evidence against it. Now, this was written some 50 years ago, so they could get away with that without being ridiculed. Now people have ideas which are just as ridiculous, but they haven't been ridiculed as much yet. And if you think about this really long, it is really easy to ridicule almost everything that there is, because one of the ideas where people try to get away from the implications of the second law of thermodynamics is they say the universe's ordered state is a result of a statistical fluctuation. So you can have something that looks sort of ordered in a chaotic state. It just kind of comes into being for a little while and then dissipates again. That's normal, right? Because things are all moving around, they're all in flux. Well, people postulated, well, what if the entire universe is some enormous fluctuation in a great grander space that just happened on a huge enough scale that it could explain everything? Well, Ludwig Boltzmann, who's one of the founders of thermodynamics, thought about this idea a good bit. And he came up with a thought experiment, which basically reduces it to absurdity, because he said it makes more sense for instead of the whole universe to arise as statistical fluctuation, to instead envision a single conscious brain that just fluxes into existence in the middle of the void for a microsecond, long enough to hallucinate the entire history of a perception up to the age you are now, and all of your memories, and just imagine all the world as it is. It's just a complete illusion. You're a brain that exists for a split second, and then it dissipates back into equilibrium. That's mathematically a lot easier than for the entire universe to fluctuate into existence and to exist for all this time. Y'all are looking like that went way over your head. But basically, I mean, it pretty much destroys the idea that the universe is a statistical fluctuation that just happened, because you can imagine hallucinatory fluctuations, which are much simpler, that could give the fake appearance of the universe being as it is without being real. So we all know that entropy increases disorder over time. So everything is going towards a more chaotic state, a more disordered state, towards equilibrium is more technically accurate. Which means that going backwards, things have to get more ordered until you get to a beginning where everything was perfectly ordered, which sounds very strangely like what Genesis said in the first place. Cosmologists have come up with a number of different ways to try to get around this. Some of them have postulated that there's a multiverse and the Big Bang just kind of happens in this multiverse space, and other multiverses also happen over time. It basically just kind of spawns new universes here and there as needed, or that some gigantic alien force caused the Big Bang, or a computer, or there's lots of different things that you can say. And then of course there's the idea that time itself did not exist before the Big Bang, and so it's meaningless to ask what happened to start it. All of which just kind of skirts around the issue, which is that you need something outside of science to explain the beginning. So the conclusion of all of those assumptions to me is saying that science and religion are against one another is actually a false dichotomy. Because all science requires things to be assumed in order to function. That's normal, just like religion requires certain things to be taken by faith. The scientific method was actually founded largely by Christians. Isaac Newton was a Christian, Galileo, Copernicus, many others. They were Christians, and they held firmly to both their faith and their science and did not see a contradiction between them. Evolution requires a number of assumptions which actually don't go well with what we can actually observe and consider in the physical world, as I went through some of these assumptions and their implications. So it's not actually a valid science anymore. It's more of a religion. It requires you to take a lot of things on faith, some of which are quite a stretch. So what we actually have is a conflict between two religions, and that's a lot easier to understand. So it still doesn't answer particularly which one is more reliable. But it is definitely more of a religion than a science. Consider the fact that you're not allowed to disprove it. Anything that you come up with which is against evolution is kind of explained away. The evidence is tweaked, the theory is tweaked to try to explain it rather than it actually being taken to discredit it. They add new rules. You can only have a natural means for the origin of life. You can't use a creator that's against the science. You can't have any external influence from the universe getting into its present state, except at the beginning, because we have no other way to do it. The fossil record is claimed to show a family tree, even though it actually does not do so very well at all. And contradictory things like irreducible complexity, which cannot be explained by natural selection, are basically just ignored. So, in a standard biology book, you would conclude that evolution is correct because there's no alternatives that are given any credence to even compare to it. Not because it's the most reliable theory. And another thing that is commonly done is evolutionists will borrow the credibility of other branches of science and try to apply it to their science to make it more unquestionable. And this is a very interesting quote. Evolutionists have physics envy. They tell the public that the science behind evolution is the same science that sends people to the moon and cures disease. It's not. The science behind evolution is not empirical but forensic. No testing, no observation, no repeatability, no falsification. I think this is what the public discerns, that evolution is just a bunch of just so stories disguised as a legitimate science. And so there you see the issue. Physics is repeatable, testable, and highly predictive. We used it to send probes to the planets, which are ridiculous lengths away with great precision. We're very good at physics, but that's because it's allowed to be false. If you do physics wrong, the answer becomes evident very quickly, right? I mean, y'all have all experienced this in your classes. You get graded. When you do evolution wrong, nobody knows if it's wrong or not, because you can't go out and test it. And the experts' theories are not allowed to be falsified, even when there's considerable evidence that they might be wrong. Instead, they just kind of tweak them to match the new evidence a little bit, or ignore the new evidence completely. Y'all remember when they found soft dinosaur tissue? Did y'all even hear about that? They found dinosaur tissue which was not fossilized. It's supposed to be at least 65 million years old without having decayed. They still haven't really produced an explanation for that. So you might say, well, what about observable evolution? Because I kept saying evolution cannot be observed. And there's the evidence of the Galapagos finches that Darwin observed that have different beak shapes as a result of natural selection. There's the example of the moths that changed their colors during the Industrial Revolution to blend into the ash-covered tree trunks better. And then they changed back when the air got cleaner. There's a variation that some humans have a median artery and some don't. I don't contest that small variations change things within different species. I mean, we've seen, of course, what you can do with breeding in dogs. And of course, natural selection can do the same thing. You put an animal in a given environment, ones that have certain traits will certainly do better, and most of the offspring will tend towards that trait by natural selection. But that doesn't mean that you can get birds from dinosaurs. There's limits to what you can get within the genetic code of each kind of creature, kind of hard-coded limits to how much it can vary. I mean, all the different dog breeds, they look quite different, but they're all still dogs. You can't get one that is not recognizable as a dog if you keep on with that process. So why do I believe what I do? Well, first of all, I know the God of the Bible. He's revealed himself to me personally. I have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ as my Savior. And I have experienced that his revelation to me through the Bible, through creation, through my own experiences are all consistent and reliable. So that's why I believe the way I do. What can you take away from it? Well, science is a reliable means of finding truth, but it has limits. And one of the main limits is the fallibility of the people doing it. And so a lot of times your scientific theory can turn into more of a religion than a science because you keep on holding to it, even though evidence is accumulating that's contrary. And sometimes assumptions are made about what is valid science, which are not good assumptions. Saying you can't have God in science is not a good assumption. Science should go where the evidence leads, whether it says there's a creator or not. And there's evidence, there's good evidence, that the world as we see it today required a designer to create it. And he wants to be found. So as it says in Romans 1, the invisible attributes of the creation make him manifest. Because he wants to be found. He made the world the way it is so that we can see that there's evidence of him in it. So as we're wrapping up, this is the Society for the Advancement of Creation Science. We're going to try to have meetings like this approximately once a month. So I hope y'all will come back. And one thing we do besides for just meet and talk about this is in the past, the society has been active in actually trying to do creation science. And so I wanted to show you all just a snippet of some of the things the different members of SACS have done in the past. This is a study of tectonic plate movement, very rapid movement, that can explain some of what happened during Noah's flood. And so they were studying the rate of movement through into the mantle of continental plates, and the idea that a plate can start to kind of plunge into the mantle if certain conditions are met. And here's a finite element simulation of that. And so you get a diffuse shear band on the olivine aggregate. Basically, under certain conditions, the friction reduces so much that the continental plate can just start to catastrophically sink into the mantle. And so using a parametric study, they identified several different things that can cause that. It's basically the question of the localization stress. If you can get the stress high enough, then you get to a point where it will strain indefinitely without increasing the stress. So if you can reach that stress, it will just continue to strain. I mean, it looks like a metal stress strain curve, and it's a very similar principle, but this is for continental plate materials. Here's a modal analysis of Noah's Ark, a scale model, 1 to 200th scale. And they made the Ark out of white oak for this experiment, and studied the vibration modes of the Ark, with the idea being, would they get seasick? And it's a good question. So here's the vibration modes that it showed. The conclusion was that it should be remarkably stable in avoiding the frequencies that people are generally sensitive to. Here's an FEA model for bending the Ark. This FEA models, if you don't know, when you show the results in the SolidWorks or whatever, you typically scale the amount of deformation up to make it more visible how it's moving. So it wouldn't actually bend that much. That just shows the amount scaled up that it would bend. So that's the way it would go, doing it that way. And they study the stresses at each point on the Ark as a result of that. Here's a torsional mode, and you can see the stresses on it there. And then they put it in a swimming pool and studied its stability in response to waves. The conclusion of all of that was that the dimensions that are given in Genesis are actually remarkably reliable for constructing a wooden vessel which can withstand water and be habitable at the same time. So it resists topicizing extremely well. It doesn't have harmful vibrations, and it is quite sturdy. So that's some of the things that Sachs has done in the past, in addition to doing talks like this. I also want to mention that we're doing a Bible study on the Gospel of John right now. We meet on Friday mornings at 7 in the room right above this one. So y'all are all invited to that if you'd like to come. We'll be starting John chapter 2 on Friday. And with that, I'll open the floor for questions. Well, it's complicated. I do believe that things are devolving, but it's a very slow rate. So, the scriptures say that the universe is sustained by the Creator. And so I think that is the main thing that is happening rather than us devolving. I think that if you compare the intelligence of an average person now to the intelligence of someone 4,000 years ago, you would not see a statistical difference that was significant.
If we, as scientists or whatever, see measurements that are, very, very old, would you think the more likely explanation is that either that stuff was created in a way that it appears as it's older than it is, or that measurement techniques are unreliable?
I think the latter is generally the preferable explanation. So I didn't talk about the age of the Earth much, but I could have. I have a whole other talk on that. But in summary, radioisotope dating tends to consistently produce extremely old measurements. However, there are a number of cases where it's known to be incorrect. We have things of known ages that it says are very old. So that's one problem. On the other hand, you can measure things with radioisotope dating using different radioisotopes and get the same answer. So that seems to be a point in its favor. And then on the other hand, again, we have non-radioisotope dating methods, such as, the salinity of the Dead Sea is increasing over time, very easily measured over the last 100 years or so. It's increasing quite significantly. If you backtrack that far enough, you should get to where it was completely pure water with no salt, right? That date occurs only a couple thousand years before Christ, not millions of years ago. So how do you explain how it didn't get salty before that? You can do the same thing with every body of water in the world, including all the oceans, and they'll all give you fairly young dates for when they must have been completely pure water. So that's just one example of a dating method that doesn't use radioisotope dating that gives a very young result. So in summary, I think that there's something off about radioisotope dating, and I'm not sure what it is. I'm not satisfied with any explanation I've seen yet. Yes, there's a certain background level of carbon-14, for instance, that's assumed. And if you take that out, it changes the date dramatically. You can also look, if you want to go into more detail on it, the RATE project is really interesting because they took hydrogen zircons and measured their age two independent ways. One of them using radioisotope dating and the other one using a diffusion rate, got quite different answers. Yes, it's an acronym, which I can't remember what it stands for, but I should find it. What else? Well, I have several problems with it. One of my favorites is that you have the plants all created on day 3 and the sun and moon not created until day 4. So you have a whole age without any source of light. for the plants to grow under. Also, it doesn't satisfactorily resolve with either evolution or anything else. For one thing, the verse in Exodus chapter 20 that I quoted, it gives the justification for the Sabbath day that was the way God did it, which doesn't make sense if it was actually 7 different long ages.
Because like like the way that God created Adam is different from like the like other animals. Like they were evolving up to a point until God gave him like spiritual, like after the breath of life, the first like a spiritual connection.
I've heard that argument.
Yeah. What are your thoughts?
So the idea basically being that evolution progressed up to a point, and then God said, okay, this is the one I'm going to endow as man.
Yeah.
That still has the major problem that the Genesis and Paul are extremely clear about death coming from Adam's sin. And in that model, you had death proceeding onward before Adam and proceeding onward after Adam with no change whatsoever. That's my main issue with that one.
Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen people explain this like death didn't count because it wasn't spiritual death, but like that, I feel like that's like making a reach off of scripture that's like not inerrant. Like,
yeah,
you can't take it at face value and think that.
Right, and of course it still runs into the issue of in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth.
Exactly.
Say not one direction together, but in the beginning, like heaven and earth, and he created light.
Okay, so that's the gap theory, right? So you have Genesis 1:1, and then you have an unspecified period of time in Genesis 1:2, right? That one still runs into the issue that it doesn't match up with evolution either. You can have the rocks be extremely old, but what about all the fossils?
Dinosaurs out.
That's a good question. There are periods of time in the past where meteorite impacts were way more common than they are now. There's enough craters that we have to accept that, I think. But as for the extinction of the dinosaurs, I think that there were dinosaurs on the earth, small ones. You can get juveniles, or eggs. But it also says shortly after that Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And it's pretty clear to me that if you were starting to resettle the earth after the flood event, you'd kind of want to take out all the major predators. So I think that humans were largely responsible for the extinction of dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs and then do they?
That's the popular model right now, and it may change in 30 years, it might not. It lines up well enough with the data that they have, ignoring the data that they don't like. And it's a cataclysmic event that's hard enough to explain what exactly would be the evidence for it, that it's hard to disprove. Besides for the fact that there are large craters here and there that had some atmospheric impact, which was pretty significant.
What do you think about the concept of light years and like the so-called expansion of the universe and how it's like 4 billion light years away of an object we're looking at?
Oh, that's a really good question. So we can see light from objects which are millions of light years away. That's pretty well established. So within standard evolutionary cosmology, there is inflationary theory, which says that the universe suddenly just expanded due to dark energy, I think they call it now, which would suddenly make everything further away than it was before, and you would still see the light from it because the light was already traveling towards you before it expanded. It might be that. It might be something similar to that. It says God stretched out the heavens, which could allude to a similar concept. It might also be that, so this is kind of tricky. It's one of my favorite models, but it's hard to explain. Basically, if God created the earth first and then kind of rolled the universe back from the earth, then the idea of what's simultaneous, it depends on your point of view. In special relativity, there's a cone of things that are simultaneous. It depends on which direction you're traveling and how fast. So if he says he created all the lights on the fourth day, I take that to be on a perspective of the light traveling towards Earth so that it would all arrive on the fourth day, no matter how far away it was. And it's fair to call that simultaneous because the light itself did not experience any time. Light never does experience time because it's going at the speed of light. And so if you measure the time going at the speed of light, according to special relativity, no time passes. How do you define race? Sure. Well, I mean, you know that some parents can have children that are extremely different from one another. If you take that a few generations down, you can see an enormous amount of variety, experimentally observable, right? If you want to go even further, look at the dog breeds. You can go from just a very small handful of ancestors to an enormous number of radically different breeds of dogs over just a few hundred years, right?
Is that what you're talking about? Evolution that we can see.
Yes.
Is that
Yes.
relating back to how?
And of course, you still have all humans can interbreed with one another quite easily. We're not all that different. And when people of mixed backgrounds interbreed now, they may have one child that looks just like the mother and one that looks just like the father almost. So you see that sort of thing taking place. All that variety is built into the genetic code. Anybody else? Well, there's more pizza. Thank you all.